to 32 if you guys want to get there. Last time I taught, we talked about Romans 1:16 to 17. So we're just going to be continuing through that. Can I have somebody read the whole thing? Or if you want to split it into two, we can. Romans 1, verses 18 to 32. You're in Romans now. There you go. Yeah, go for it.
The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man, and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurities, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversions. Furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought to be done, not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They are senseless, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have a pretty long passage here, and it starts out in verse 18, and it starts talking about the wrath of God. So, to understand this passage, you have to see how holy God is in all of this, that he is perfect and set apart from us, that he is far greater than us, and that's what the reason that he has wrath against us. It's because of our sin, that we don't live up to his standard of perfection, and because he is perfect, he cannot allow imperfection into heaven, and that's why he has wrath against us, because it is a righteous anger against sin. It's not like some guy who can't control his emotions, that he's just mad at us for no reason. But no, that's not the way it is with God. He is mad against our sin, and it is a perfect and just wrath. And it says that it's being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men. So again, like I said, it's not some anger that's kind of like he's freaking out and he doesn't know what he's doing. It is a righteous anger, and it is against sin, because we all have sin, and it deserves to be punished in eternity for our sin, that we deserve to go to hell when we die. And our punishment will either be absorbed by Christ on the cross, or it will be us in hell, because the wages of sin is death, as it says in Romans 3:23. And then it says that they suppress the truth by their wickedness. So this means that they deny God in our sin. That when we sin, it's like we are saying, God, I think I know better than you, and I really don't want to listen to you. So they're denying God by suppressing the truth by their wickedness. And then verse 19 it says, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. So this talks about our conscience, that every human being has a conscience. And you can see this in like our laws across the nations, that a lot of the countries have similar laws about morality, and that's not because, we just happen to make them up the same way. That's because God has given everybody a conscience, because we are made in His image, and He made man with a moral soul, that He had a relationship with them in the Garden of Eden, but we corrupted it by our sin. And this conscience is not enough to save us. We can't just, in our own mind, just say, oh yeah, I know about Jesus Christ. But we do know that there is such a thing as God, because we can see it in the creation, like it says in verse 20, the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen. So we can see in nature, there had to have been somebody who made this. There had to have been somebody who made our bodies to be able to function, because it's just impossible for this to just randomly happen. And like I said, it's not enough for us to be saved by it, because Romans 3 says that our sin has blinded us. There's none righteous, no, not even one. There's none who understands, no one who seeks God. All have turned away, they have together become worthless. There's none who does good, not even one. And then it keeps going. So our sin has blinded us, and that's why we need Jesus Christ to regenerate our hearts and give us new life, that we may see the glory of God and worship Him as He is. And then, like I said, verse 20, it talks about that we can know God's power and that He exists, and we can know that we are sinful, from verse 20 here. So that men are without excuse, it says. So we are without excuse for not believing God, because we can see in nature that somebody created us, somebody created something, that this whole world, and we have no reason to say, God, I didn't know that you existed. You can't die and say, God, I didn't have any chance to believe. No, it says that you have a conscience that convicts you of your sin. We're in Romans 1. Oh, you already got it. Okay, verse 21. It says, for although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. So it says, although they knew God. That doesn't mean like they knew Him, they were saved, they intimately knew Him. That's not what it's talking about here. It says that they knew about God, like I was saying with the creation. And they neither glorified Him as God. So that means they didn't worship Him, and nor gave thanks to Him. And this is a good reminder with Thanksgiving, that, when we don't give thanks to God, we are sinning, and we are darkening our minds, because we are not putting the glory of God in the forefront, and we're not worshiping Him for who He is. And that leads to a big list of progression into worse and worse sin, as you'll see here, like that whole list that we got at the end of the verse. So we need to submit to His lordship, and we need to honor Him as He deserves, and we're denying Him if we're not being thankful. So then it turns into foolish hearts were darkened, which is our depravity, like I read in Romans 3. Verse 22, it says, although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. How many of you think that the world around us claims to have all the answers? Like scientists, they think they know everything, but then they change their answer every 5 seconds. Or, I don't know, even like in history, they think they had the answer, but then we laugh at like, oh, you thought the world was flat, haha, you guys thought you were so smart, we know better now. That's what the world says. They think that they know best. Like it says, although they claim to be wise, they became fools. So the world around us thinks they have all the answers, but really they're missing the biggest thing in the world. They're missing Jesus Christ and honoring God. And God calls them fools for not honoring him and not submitting to him, because the creation doesn't know more than the Creator. Obviously, God knows much more than us. Verse 23, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man, and birds and animals and reptiles. Now, they were committing idolatry, and they didn't worship God for who he is, but obviously a lot of times we don't worship images like made of birds or animals or things like that, but we do worship other things, kind of, because worship is just giving your devotion to something. So what kind of things do you think we worship or place in front of God sometimes?
Academics.
Yeah, a lot of people do their grades. That's one thing I wrote down. What else?
Social.
Yep, social media. That takes a lot of our time away. Good one. Sports.
Friends.
Yep, friends. Music. Yep. Yeah, anything that takes our time away from God can become an idol if we're placing it in front of God. So we need to make sure that our focus is always on God. Not that these things are always bad, but if we exchange that for the best thing, then it is bad. Verse 24, it says, therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. So this talks about the sovereignty of God in salvation, that God is in control of everything, and that he has, like Romans 9 says, he has mercy on whom he has mercy. So he is the God who can controls our salvation, and he brings us to salvation even though we don't deserve anything. And it says that God gave them over in their sinful desires of their hearts. So put simply, he let their sin control them. He did not, nobody deserves to be drawn unto salvation, and these people rejected God by sinning. And God says, okay, have whatever you want. And these sexual sins that a lot of society does, that is really running rampant, is very dangerous, because it says the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. And then it gives a whole list of things that follow from these sexual sins. So you need to be careful with these sexual sins that even Christians can struggle with, because it can lead to a very slippery slope of sins that will be hard to get out of later. So verse 25, it says, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. So their sexual sins go into believing false truth, that is, believing in another God, or like it says, worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator. So they were living for themselves, they were living for their own desires, they were living for sex, things like that. And we already talked about idolatry. And then that leads to verse 26, because of this God gave them over to shameful lust. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. And verse 27 also, in the same way, men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversion. So the sexual sins led to idolatry and putting something in front of God. And then verse 26 and 27, it sees the progression to homosexuality and that sin. So the progression keeps getting worse and worse, and it says that that God has created man to have a marriage relationship with one man and one woman forever, that it's for life. And do you think that our culture has abandoned that? Do you think we're into this progression stage? I think so too. So the sexual sins lead to idolatry and have led to homosexuality. And now, what's up, guys? Yeah, so our society has done that, and we need to be spreading the gospel even more so because we have this sinful desires that have led to a lot of sin in our society. We're in Romans 1, verse 28. Furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, He gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. So we'll read to verse 31 even. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They are senseless, faithless, heartless, ruthless. So that's a very long list. So they didn't want to believe God because God exposed their sin. They exposed their sexual sins. God exposed their idolatry and their homosexual desires. And those sins led to even more sin in the darkening of their mind. It says depraved mind. And it lists all these different things that we shouldn't be doing. But I think a lot of us have done all this stuff. I know I've done some of them. Like greed. A lot of us have probably been greedy. Envy. We've done those. Deceit, lying. We've done that. Gossiping, slandering. We've done those. They disobey their parents. We've all probably done that. All things like that. We've probably done some of these things. And it puts that on the same level as God-haters. So even our little sins that we commit nearly every day are terrible because it's equivalent to God-haters in verse 30 and other things like that. It's equivalent to murder. So we need to be careful of our sin leading to this progression of even worse sins and darkening our minds. And then finally, verse 32, although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. So we know that our sin deserves punishment. So, for example, if a murderer was standing in the court of law and he says, "Yep, I am condemned," he's standing in front of the judge and he said, "Yep, I did it," and the judge says, "You deserve death. What are you gonna argue for me so that I can go free?" And he says, "Well, I was a good person before I murdered this guy, and I think you should let me go because I went to church a couple times and I was a good person to the poor people." The judge is obviously gonna say, "No, you deserve the punishment you deserve. It doesn't matter how good you were before." And the same thing is with God, that with our sin we can't say, "Oh, well, we were a good person and we should go to heaven because we were a good person." No, we still deserve death, and that death has to be nullified by the death of Christ. It has to be Him standing in our place, and we know that with all those verses, for by grace you have been saved. It's only by faith in Jesus Christ and by grace that we are saved. And then this is a pretty practical end of the verse here. It says, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. So for Christians, it is also sin for us to say, well, that's sin, but it's not really that bad, and to approve of it. It says it's sin to approve of those evil practices. So that's something we need to be aware of, that we need to make sure that we're not approving of sin. So with this long passage, I wrote down some things that we could learn from it. First, that God is holy and above us, and we shouldn't even think that we can come near His glory. And that should influence our awe and our praise for God every day in our prayer, in our Bible study, and in our witness. And what else? We should also remember that we have all sinned and are without an excuse, because sin is a serious offense against God. And that should cause us to praise His grace even more, because we deserve eternal punishment, and we shouldn't take advantage of it. Like in Romans 6:1, it says, what shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. We died to sin. How can we live in it any longer? So if we've been saved, we should live like it, because we should praise God's grace against our sin, that we don't deserve anything. We should learn that the sovereignty of God comforts us that God is in control of everything and causes us to humbly depend on Him for salvation and for everything that we need, because He's the one who can give it. 2 more things. What do you place in front of God? Is your sin causing distance between you and God? Are you not giving Him enough time? Are you putting sports or music in front of Him? And how burdened does that make you for the lost? Like, with the weight of sin, you know that sin deserves death. Does that cause you to live like it and to show that to other people that Christ really does save them even though they don't deserve it? And last thing, are we approving of sin in our friendships with people that they aren't honoring God, and we're not trying to witness to them? Are we approving of sin by our language, by swearing and doing things that the world would want us to do? Are we approving of sin by our actions and the time that we spend with God? We need to be spending more time with God instead of wasting it on other things. So keep our eyes focused on God and not on our sin, that we can be turning to Him even from the little sins and not progress to the bigger ones. All right.